There's a certain honesty to studying the shelters soldiers built in World War II. They weren't, romanticized log cabins or well-prepared campsites. These were structures put together by exhausted men fighting cold, wet and unforgiving conditions with nothing but issued gear, natural materials and whatever scraps they could scavenge. When you read through soldier diaries from the Eastern Front, Italy, the Pacific Islands and the Ardennes, one theme repeats itself. The men who survived longest were the ones who understood shelter better than anyone else. Before we get into these 10 shelter methods, understand this. Every single one wasn't just clever. It was born out of necessity when exposure became just as lethal as enemy fire. And that's why they remain incredibly valuable knowledge for any prepper or historian who understands that survival is ultimately about managing the environment as much as the enemy. The first method is lowering the shelter footprint to stay below the wind line. Soldiers learned quickly that a traditional above-ground tent caught wind, lost heat and soaked through faster than anything else. So they dug shallow pits about a foot deep before pitching their shelter halves. This dropped the living space below the wind, reduced exposure and made a flimsy tent significantly warmer. You can do the same today by clearing a shallow depression or using natural dips in the ground before setting up a tarp or tent. The earth blocks wind better than any fabric ever will. The second method is reinforcing shelter roofs with brush and evergreen layers. Canvas alone was, honestly, pretty much worthless in freezing rain. Soldiers in forested regions layered evergreen boughs, branches and brush over their tent roofs to create a natural thatching that shed water and insulated heat. This method works today with any tarp setup. Add thick layers of natural material above the tarp, and you dramatically reduce dripping and condensation inside. A shelter in a perfect spot meant nothing if water pooled underneath it. Experienced World War II troops would carve these small V-shaped channels around the perimeter of their tents, sending runoff downhill instead of into their sleeping area. Any time you camp in wet conditions, just take 5 minutes to do the same. Dig a shallow channel that guides water away from your bed. It's simple, reliable, and honestly, it transforms a miserable night into a manageable one. The fourth method is building raised sleeping platforms from logs and scrap wood. The ground was the enemy. Cold ground, wet ground, muddy ground. It drained body heat instantly. So soldiers built raised platforms by laying logs side by side and covering them with branches or issued mats. If you're ever in a survival situation, collect anything rigid, branches, boards, bark sheets, and create a raised layer to sleep on. Even just a few inches of elevation, prevents hypothermia. The fifth method is creating heat bowls inside dugouts. In deep snow or wet earth, soldiers dug body-size bowls beside their main shelter and placed warm stones or small ember piles inside them. These heat bowls stored warmth and released it slowly throughout the night, warming the air around the sleeping area without open flame risk. The sixth method is the double roof tactic that infantry used to stop condensation. The seventh method is making ground insulation carpets from natural debris. When materials were scarce, Soldiers raked together layers of pine needles, leaves and bark to form thick mats beneath their bedding. This natural insulation created a barrier between their bodies and the cold earth. The eighth method is using reflective walls to bounce heat back into the shelter. On the front lines, soldiers built waist-high walls of logs or stacked branches behind their fires. These reflected heat back into their shelter rather than losing it to the open air. The ninth method is roof weighting during storms. In heavy snow or rain, shelters collapsed easily. Soldiers placed logs, rocks or sandbags evenly across the top edges of their tents to increase tension and prevent sagging. The same principle applies with modern tarps. Weighting edges creates a tight pitch that sheds precipitation properly. A sagging roof always leads to soaked gear. The 10th method is combining camouflage with structural stability. One overlooked aspect of soldier shelters is that concealment often doubled as reinforcement. Soldiers packed mud, leaves and broken branches into the sides of their lean-tos or dugouts for both disguise and insulation. In a practical sense, any time you build a survival shelter, integrating natural materials around the frame reduces wind penetration and adds stability while blending it with the environment. Every one of these methods reflects the same truth. World War II soldiers didn't survive because they had perfect gear. They survived because they understood how to work with terrain, weather and physics better than most people today. These techniques remain effective, not because they're nostalgic, but because they're grounded in physical reality. If you take the time to practice even a few of them, you'll discover that environmental control is the real foundation of survival, something those soldiers learned under circumstances none of us hope to face. If this breakdown helped expand your understanding of practical World War II fieldcraft, subscribe to The Prepper Historian and share this guide with anyone who values real, usable history.